I didn't plan to ruin a man's life. I just wanted to park in my own driveway. That's it. That was the bar, incredibly low, almost embarrassingly reasonable, and yet somehow completely out of reach for 6 straight months. Every single night, I'd pull up after work, exhausted, back aching, brain fried, just wanting to shut the world off and step inside my own house. And there it was again, like clockwork, this glossy black Tesla Model S parked right across my driveway like it owned the place. Not slightly over, not, oops my bad, territory. No, dead center, blocking the whole thing like it was making a statement. And the worst part? It wasn't some random stranger. It was my neighbor. Well, neighbor feels too friendly a word. Let's call him what he really was. Evan Caldwell, startup guy, mid-40s. Always in athleisure like he just came from a meeting that somehow involved both venture capital and yoga, the kind of guy who smiles at you without actually seeing you. He moved in last year, bought the biggest house on the street, and immediately started acting like the rest of us were background noise in his personal success montage. Now here's the thing, Evan had space. Plenty of it. His garage? Packed with toys. I'm talking a vintage motorcycle, some kind of absurd Peloton setup, boxes labeled crypto rigs, whatever that means. His driveway? Already occupied by his wife's Range Rover and his college-aged kid's BMW. So instead of, I don't know, reorganizing his life like a normal person, he decided my driveway was the overflow lot. Just mine. No one else's. Like I'd somehow been quietly rezoned into public inconvenience area. At first, I tried to be cool about it. Left a note, polite, respectful, even apologetic in tone, like I was the one asking for a favor. Hey, would you mind not blocking my driveway? Thanks so much. You know, basic human decency. The next day, same car, same spot. So I knocked on his door. He answered, AirPods in, barely pausing whatever podcast was feeding him his daily dose of self-importance. Hey man, I said, keeping it light. Any chance you could keep your car clear of my driveway? And he just smirked. Not even a full smile, just that little upward twitch that says, I heard you. I just don't care. Then he goes, yeah, parking's kinda tight around here, you know how it is. And I'm standing there thinking, no, actually, I don't, because I've never parked in someone else's driveway like a sociopath. But I nodded, because I'm not trying to escalate things, not yet. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and nothing changed. I called the non-emergency line twice. Both times they told me it was a civil issue, something about property disputes, not their jurisdiction unless there's immediate danger. Which, apparently, being slowly driven insane doesn't qualify as. Meanwhile, my life started bending around this guy's laziness. I'd park down the street, sometimes 2, 3 blocks away, hauling groceries, tools, whatever I had, back to the house like I was prepping for a wilderness expedition instead of just going home. And then there was my mom. She lives with me. She's older, not as steady on her feet as she used to be, still stubborn as ever though. One night, I watched her try to carry 2 grocery bags from halfway down the block, because guess what? Evan's Tesla was parked right where her car should have been. She didn't complain, not once, but I saw it, the way she paused halfway up the sidewalk, catching her breath, pretending everything was fine. That did something to me. That shifted it from annoying neighbor situation to something a lot more personal. And still, I tried. I left another note, less polite this time, still not aggressive, just firmer. No response. I even texted him once after he gave me his number in what I can only assume was a moment of performative neighborliness. No reply. But every time he saw me, same smirk, same casual disregard, like I was a minor inconvenience in his otherwise optimized life. And then came that night, the one that changed everything. I just finished a double shift, 12 hours on my feet, brain running on fumes and bad coffee. I turn onto my street, already knowing what I'm going to see, and sure enough, there it is, that black Tesla, parked like it paid rent. I just sat there for a second, engine running, hands on the wheel, staring at it. And I felt it that snap. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet clarity. Like something inside me finally lined up and said, we're done asking. I got out of the truck, walked up to the driveway, and there he was, standing on his porch, phone in hand, watching me like this was entertainment. Rough day, he calls out, almost amused. And I looked at him, really looked this time, and for the first time in 6 months, I smiled. Not because anything was funny, but because I suddenly remembered something. Something buried way back, something my grandfather used to talk about, something I hadn't thought of in years. You see, this house, it wasn't just something I bought. It was passed down to me. My grandfather built it, lived here his whole life, and before that, he worked as a land surveyor. The kind of guy who didn't just measure property lines, he documented them, obsessively, meticulously, like his life depended on it. And somewhere in this house, tucked away in a cabinet I hadn't opened in forever, were those records. Old maps, deeds, agreements, things most people would call junk, but I suddenly realized might be something else entirely. I glanced back at Evan, still leaning there, still smirking, completely unaware that the game he'd been playing for months? Yeah, it had just changed. Not because I was angrier, not because I was louder, but because I finally remembered the rules. Now let me pause the story for a second, because this is where things stop being just annoying neighbor drama and start turning into something way more interesting, and honestly, way more common than people realize. See, according to standard procedure in most residential neighborhoods, especially ones governed by informal agreements or HOAs, blocking someone's driveway isn't just rude. It's usually a violation of local ordinances or community rules. But here's the catch. Enforcement is messy. Police often treat it as a civil issue unless there's immediate safety risk, which means you're stuck in this weird gray zone where you're clearly being wronged, but nobody with authority is jumping in to fix it. And that's where people get trapped. This is a psychological trap. You start second-guessing yourself, wondering if you're overreacting, if maybe it's not worth the conflict, while the other person keeps pushing boundaries because, well, nothing's stopping them. From a legal perspective, though, property rights are a different beast entirely. Easements, land use agreements, zoning restrictions, these aren't just paperwork, they're leverage. The kind of leverage most people forget they even have. And guys like Evan, they bank on that ignorance. They operate in that comfortable space where they assume no one's going to dig deeper, no one's going to challenge the system, because it's inconvenient, it's complicated, and frankly, it's intimidating. But here's the thing. They're not untouchable, they're just unchallenged. And once someone decides to actually understand the rules instead of just playing nice within them, that's when the whole dynamic flips. So that night, after I stood there smiling like a man who just remembered where he left the key to a locked door, I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't even ask him to move the car again. I just nodded, turned around, and went inside. And if you'd been watching from across the street, you probably would have thought, yeah, he finally gave up. But no, that was the exact moment I stopped reacting and started planning. I went straight to the back room, the one that still smelled faintly like old paper and dust and my grandfather's aftershave, and I pulled open that dented metal filing cabinet I hadn't touched in years. Inside, folders, stacks, yellowed envelopes, all labeled in his handwriting, neat, precise, almost obsessive, and then I found it. Property lines, 1964. My hands actually paused for a second, like even they understood this might be something big. I sat down, flipped it open, and there it was, original survey maps, boundary descriptions, notes scribbled in the margins, and buried in the middle of it all, a document that made my heart start beating a little faster, an easement agreement. Not just any easement, a conditional one. Now, I'm not going to pretend I understood everything right away. I'm not a lawyer, but I knew enough to recognize language that matters. Phrases like revocable under breach, non-commercial use, granted access contingent upon compliance. That's not casual wording. That's a loaded weapon if you know how to use it. So I did what most people don't bother doing. I kept going. The next morning, instead of sleeping in after a brutal week, I was at the county records office right when they opened, coffee in one hand, folder in the other, looking like a guy who had just discovered a glitch in the system and wasn't about to ignore it. I cross-referenced everything, parcel maps, zoning records, ownership history, and slowly, piece by piece, the picture came together. Decades ago, my grandfather had owned a much larger stretch of land, including what is now our entire street. When the city developed the neighborhood, he granted them a 30-foot easement so they could build the road, but he attached conditions. Specific ones. The road was to remain strictly for residential access, and any violation of that, especially commercial activity, gave the original grantor, or their successors the right to revoke it. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because Evan, he wasn't just working from home casually like the rest of us pretending to be productive in sweatpants. No, he was running a full-on consulting business out of his house. Clients coming and going all day, cars lining the street, meetings happening on his patio like it was some kind of open-air boardroom. I'd seen it for months, never thought twice about it beyond the annoyance. But now? Now it looked different. Now it looked like evidence. So I started documenting. Not obsessively, not recklessly, methodically. Dates, times, photos. His business license, publicly listed with his home address. His LinkedIn profile. Yeah, I checked, mentioning client sessions hosted at private residence. Even screenshots of the little yard sign he'd proudly placed near the sidewalk advertising his services like this was a commercial district. Every piece added weight. Every detail turned a vague irritation into a solid case. By the end of the weekend, I wasn't just mad anymore. I was prepared. Monday morning, I sat down with a property attorney, a guy who, within 10 minutes of looking at my documents, leaned back in his chair and said, "You realize what this means, right?" And I just nodded, because yeah, I did. We filed the paperwork that same day. Official notice of easement violation, request for revocation based on breach of original conditions. It sounded complicated, but really, it was just me finally using the rules that had been there all along. And then we waited. Tuesday felt like a week. I went to work, came home, still parked on the street because of course the Tesla was there again. Funny how some habits die hard. But this time, it didn't bother me the same way. Because I knew something he didn't. Wednesday afternoon, I got the call. Court order approved. Easement revoked. Just like that. No dramatic music, no courtroom showdown. Just a quiet confirmation that everything I'd found, everything I'd built, was valid. That evening, I made sure I was home early. Not because I needed to be, but because I wanted to see it. Around 5:30, a county truck rolled in, followed by a sheriff's cruiser. They didn't rush, didn't make a scene, just got to work. Bright orange cones, temporary barriers, signage, no access, private property. It was almost surreal, watching the street I'd driven down my entire life suddenly transform into something restricted. And then, right on cue, Evan's Tesla turned the corner. Slowed down. Stopped. You could practically feel the confusion through the windshield. He rolled it forward a few feet, like maybe this was temporary, maybe it didn't apply to him. And then the deputy stepped forward, calm, professional, holding a stack of papers. I couldn't hear the exact words from where I stood on my porch, but I didn't need to. I saw Evan step out of the car, posture shifting, that easy confidence replaced with something tighter, sharper. He took the papers, scanned them, looked up, and for the first time since he moved in, that smirk was gone. Completely gone. He looked around, like the answer might be hiding somewhere on the street. Like this was all some kind of misunderstanding that would correct itself if he just waited long enough. It didn't. The deputy pointed toward the barriers, explained the situation, no legal access, easement revoked, entry prohibited. Evans said something, quick, defensive. The deputy just shook his head slightly. The universal sign for this isn't a discussion. And just like that, the man who had treated my driveway like it didn't matter was now standing in front of a road he legally couldn't use. The irony wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, almost elegant. Over the next few hours, the reality started to settle in. His wife's Range Rover pulled up, stopped at the same barrier, confusion turning into frustration. His kid showed up later in that shiny BMW 3 Series, same reaction. One by one, they all realized the same thing, there was no way in. And it wasn't temporary. This wasn't construction, wasn't a detour, this was legal. By the next morning, the whole neighborhood knew. Not because I told them, but because nothing travels faster than a quiet street suddenly becoming inaccessible. People came out, stood on sidewalks, whispered, speculated. And here's the part one didn't expect. They weren't on his side. Turns out, I wasn't the only one dealing with Evan's version of convenience. He'd blocked other driveways, hosted loud client meetings at odd hours, treated shared space like it belonged to him. I just happened to be the one who finally pushed back, with paperwork instead of arguments. By day 2, Evan had lawyers involved. Expensive ones. You could tell by the way they showed up. Sharp suits, serious faces, carrying folders that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage. They went back and forth with my attorney, digging, questioning, trying to find a loophole, but there wasn't one. The agreement was clear, the violation was documented, and the revocation? Completely valid. And then came the moment I think he finally understood the weight of it all. One of his lawyers, standing right there on the sidewalk, lowered his voice, still not quiet enough, and said something along the lines of, "Without access, the property is effectively non-functional." That's a polite way of saying, worthless. No road access means no guaranteed utilities, no emergency services, no deliveries, no legal way for guests to enter. That million-dollar house. It wasn't a home anymore, it was an island. And Evan? He was stuck on it. Over the next week, the shift in him was noticeable. Gone was the casual arrogance, the dismissive smirk. In its place, tension, urgency, the kind of energy you see when someone realizes they're not in control anymore. He started parking 6 blocks away, walking in with groceries, briefcase, whatever he had, the same way I had been doing for months. I'd see him sometimes, passing by, no eye contact, no comments, just quiet, focused steps. His clients? Confused. Some never made it. Others called, canceled, moved meetings elsewhere. That steady stream of business he'd been running from his home slowed to a trickle. And me? I didn't gloat, didn't confront him. I just lived my life. Parked where I wanted, helped my mom carry groceries straight from the car to the front door, something that suddenly felt like a luxury again. 2 weeks in, there was a knock on my door. Not Evan. His wife. She looked tired. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just genuinely worn down. "Can we talk?" she asked, voice softer than I'd ever heard from that household. And in that moment, standing there, I realized something. This was no longer about a parking spot. It was about consequences. And now, they were ready to listen. So yeah, that's how a guy who couldn't be bothered to move his car ended up negotiating for access to his own house. And look, I know how this sounds. It sounds extreme, maybe even a little petty if you strip it down to the headline. Man blocks driveway, neighbor shuts down street. But that's not really what happened here, not even close. What happened was a slow build, a pattern, a series of small decisions that added up over time, and eventually, something had to give. Because the truth is, situations like this aren't about parking. They're about boundaries. They're about what people think they can get away with when nobody pushes back. And if you've ever dealt with someone like Evan, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The kind of person who tests limits not by breaking them outright, but by leaning on them, over and over, just enough to see if anyone's going to say anything. And when no one does, that behavior doesn't stay the same, it escalates. This is a psychological trap, and it's a sneaky one. You start small. It's just a car. It's not worth the argument. Then it becomes routine. Then it becomes expectation. And before you know it, you're the one adjusting your life to accommodate someone else's disrespect. That's how people lose ground without even realizing it. And here's where it gets real important. Because from a legal perspective, most people assume they're powerless in these situations, like unless something dramatic happens, there's nothing you can do. But that's not true. Not even a little bit. According to standard procedure in property law, especially in older neighborhoods with layered ownership history, there are often agreements in place. Easements, covenants, zoning conditions that people forget about, ignore, or never even learn exist. And those documents, they matter. A lot. They're not just dusty paperwork sitting in a drawer somewhere. They're active frameworks that define how land can be used, who has access, and under what conditions that access can be revoked. The problem is, most people don't look. They assume the system is fixed, that what exists now is how it's always going to be. And people like Evan, they rely on that assumption. They operate comfortably in that blind spot. But here's the shift, and this is the part one really want you to take away. Once you understand the structure, once you actually learn the rules instead of just reacting to situations, everything changes. You're no longer stuck asking for fairness. You're operating with leverage. And leverage doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be aggressive. Sometimes it's quiet, procedural, almost invisible until it suddenly isn't. That's what happened here. I didn't out-yell him. I didn't out-muscle him. I out-informed him. And when that happens, the dynamic flips fast. Now, let's talk about resolution, because I didn't just leave things the way they were. I could have, legally speaking, I was within my rights to keep that easement revoked indefinitely, let him deal with the consequences of his own behavior, and part of me, honestly, part of me considered it. But that's not really the kind of neighborhood I want to live in, and it's not the kind of person I want to be long-term. So when his wife came to the door, when the conversation finally shifted from entitlement to accountability, I listened. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. And we worked something out. Structured, documented, non-negotiable. His business? Relocated within 30 days. No more client traffic turning a residential street into a revolving door. The parking issue? Permanently addressed, written agreement, zero tolerance. Any violation triggers immediate action. And the easement itself? Reinstated, but not for free. Annual fee, legally binding, because access has value, and that value had been ignored for far too long. The lesson here is simple, but it's not easy. Respect isn't enforced by words. It's enforced by boundaries, and boundaries only work when they're backed by something real. Whether that's legal knowledge, documentation, or just the willingness to follow through, you need more than frustration to create change. You need structure. And maybe the biggest takeaway of all, don't wait until you're pushed to your limit to start paying attention. The information you need is usually already there, sitting in a file, buried in a clause, waiting for someone to actually read it. So if you're dealing with something like this, neighbor disputes, HOA nonsense, property issues, don't just react, dig. Ask questions. Learn how your situation is actually defined on paper, because that paper, it might be the difference between feeling stuck and realizing you've had options the whole time. And I'm curious, what would you have done? Would you have gone the legal route, or just kept trying to work it out? Because I'll be honest, 6 months ago, I probably would have chosen differently.